What was the best you have no power here moment you have ever seen? I worked in management at a theater for a while. If the concession counter was slammed and I was able, I'd leave my post and help them sling popcorn. One night while helping out, a particularly belligerent man started cussing out a 16-year-old girl on a cash register for being too slow, even suggesting she quit since she clearly couldn't handle pushing buttons or scooping popcorn. It was pretty disgusting and I felt so bad for the girl. I stepped in and told the guy that our employees have the right to refuse service to customers who harass them as part of our anti-harassment discrimination policy, empathized that the lines were longer than usual, and suggested he should apologize and move on. He was pissed. Left half his order on the counter and started fuming off. Anticipating his next move, I went back to my original post that night, as manager of the customer service kiosk. Oh boy, the look on his face when he saw me. Didn't want a refund of his tickets though, so I assume he watched the movie without popcorn. I worked for 8 years servicing communications equipment on site. 5 of those years were as the department manager. When oil was found in our area, we got so busy we could barely even think. Most of my team were pulling 12+ hour days 6 days a week and we were struggling to hire people quick enough. One day, the CEO texted and said he hired an assistant manager for me, which was something I desperately needed. I was dirty as hell from my previous job and swung by the store to pick him up and take him to one of our sites where he would be doing paperwork. The moment he got in the truck, he immediately started talking shit. He started telling me about how everything we were doing is fricked up and the department manager my name was a total moron and he would have my job within a few months. I just sat and mostly listened. He obviously didn't know shit about my industry and every time he would say something wrong, I would try to politely correct him and he'd either backtrack or insist that I was trained wrong. When we got to the site out in the middle of the West Texas desert, he complained about the layer of dust on everything and ordered me to clean up the entire site. When I sat down at my desk, the guy continued to be my ear off about everything that was wrong and chastised me for sitting down at my desk when he told me to clean up the site. So I called for a taxi, filled out a notice of termination, and handed it to him. He looked absolutely shocked. Then he defiantly protested that only Sia could fire him. I said, "And my name, right?" He sheepishly nodded. So I stuck my hand out for a handshake and introduced myself. I can teach anyone how to service equipment, but I don't have a clue how to teach someone to not be an asshole. When I was in high school I worked at popular warehouse clubs selling computers on the weekends. I was hired by the store manager via referral of a friend. I loved computers and they thought I'd make a good salesman, so my job was to stay in the computer department and sell computers, nothing else. Well, one of the shift managers didn't like that and insisted that I needed to go fold clothes for a while. As in, half my damn shift. I told him that the store manager had instructed me never to leave the technology department, but he insisted. This went on for several weeks. The store manager showed up one weekend when both the power trip-in shift manager and I were working. The store manager walks up with the shift manager close behind. Store manager slaps a stack of green bar paper, this was a while ago, down onto a shelf and points to some highlighted numbers. He looks at the shift manager and says, "Do you see this? This is our average technology sales numbers for the weeks you are on shift. See this number over here? This is our average technology sales numbers for weeks you are not. At this point, it would be more cost effective for me to simply fire you. What do you think of that solution?" The guy stammers and stutters like a toddler caught bullying another kid on the playground. Fortunately, the dude wasn't fired, but the store manager made it clear that when I was on shift, I was not to leave the technology department unless I was on break or there was a fire in the store. That shift manager never said another word to me. New CEO came to our department on the first day of his work. He didn't have a pass card yet and a lower level employee told him that he can't enter without pass card. CEO got upset and ordered a worker to let him in, but the worker insisted, "Show me the pass card, or you're not entering." Few days later this worker got a bonus. I worked at a grocery store for 5 years putting up with crazy customers and their awful attitudes. At the end of my tenure our store was set to be closed, and for the last month the store was sold to a liquidation company. Meaning we were no longer under our parent company's umbrella and were no longer concerned with retaining customer loyalty. I got to tell customers no and respond with every bit of sarcasm and disdain to every Karen I encountered for 1 month until the store officially closed. That would be a customer we had named Nick. I'll leave his last name out to protect the stupid. He would email us and always CC editor at sumnation.com and most of his emails were things like "nothing fucking works." None of the national newspapers responded. I imagine some underling just rolled his eyes and deleted them. Finally he said, "Fix this in 5 minutes or I cancel." My manager says, "Let me see that email." He responded, "Thank you, I cancelled your account." We don't want customers like you anyway. If you want to contact the media, that's your call. I'll happily provide the months of threatening emails you sent to my staff. He gave us months of headaches over a £45 quarter account. We definitely didn't need him. When I was working customer service for a restaurant delivery service, not unlike DoorDash, I had a customer send in a complaint about hair in their food. The hair was sitting on top of the food. I checked their account, and they had one order on their account, which is a red flag. I check their phone number and find multiple accounts, each other 1-2 orders, all of them complaining about hair in the food. I deny a refund because the customer has actually used the same identical photo for the last order since they ordered the same thing. The customer tries to argue with me, threaten to never use the service again. Typical stuff that they always say. Eventually the customer gives up and ends the call, then immediately tries again. I get the support request. See who it is, then deny the refund again. She ends the call, then tries again. The person behind me gets the call. I tap the person on the shoulder and show them what I pulled up on my screen and that person denies the refund. The next day she calls back and tries again and is outside of the refund window, so the customer demands to speak to her supervisor. The supervisor bans her from the service for multiple fraudulent refund requests. When an unhappy client threatens to go hire a better lawyer, they don't seem to get that this isn't a threat when they aren't paying me. I worked at a movie theater and some customers were adamant that a staff member had stolen their wallet after they dropped it. Turns out that these people just couldn't see and found the wallet once they actually looked for it. They got irate with literally everyone, from the mall security to the managers to the staff. Mall security finally said, "Get the frick out," and the customers went, "You can't say that. This isn't your theater, we're customers." Mall security guy promptly said, "This is my mall, and I can do whatever the frick I want." Right, double quotation mark. I joined the Army Reserve in 1983, in between my junior and senior year in high school. Going to drill one weekend and we were doing war games with another reserve unit. They mailed everyone a letter with the challenge and response to be let into the unit. As a lowly private, I was standing guard at the entrance and had to say the challenge. Everything's going good until a city police car pulls up and the cop is a new lieutenant. I give the challenge and he just look at me. I say it again and he said to just let him in because he didn't know it. He starts getting belligerent and I ask him to turn off the car and step out. He gets out and starts yelling at me. The sergeant major heard the commotion and comes over and tells the young lieutenant, "You asshole." It was very satisfying to watch, and I learned that day that even though a second lieutenant outranks a sergeant major, it really doesn't matter because the sergeant major had been in for 20 years and didn't put up with any bullshit. I personally had one that I'm quite proud of. I was one of 2 mechanics responsible for an annual inspection on a Piper Arrow fixed wing prop aircraft. Aside from dismal compression ratios and some odds and ends in the aircraft that could be overlooked by technicality, there was a problem with the main landing gear motor. The down and lock cycle for that aircraft is required by the OEM, and by extension federal law, to be 30 seconds or less across one cycle of the motor. This plane's gear requires 3 to 5 cycles across about 2 minutes to achieve down lock. I told the owner, who was a famously sleazy law, that he can't fly his plane and I won't sign off the annual until the main landing gear are fixed. The law told me to sign off the annual and he'll get to fixing the gear some other time. When I said no, he proceeded to threaten my job and demanded to have the plane back so he could get another mechanic to sign it off as airworthy. I laughed in his face, impounded his aircraft and notified the FAA. The man eventually gave his aircraft to my business I was working for at the time by way of title lien in order to pay off the massive hangar fees he racked up from his plane sitting in my shop. My dad is 6 feet 3 feet. I'm 6 feet 10. Sometime in my early teens, I shot past him. Dad was a yeller. Not doing what he thought I should be. No discussion, just yell. But I realized at some point that he wouldn't yell at me if he had to look up while he was doing it. I don't remember what our last argument was about, I just remember that I'd sort of caught on at this point. So I'm in my room in front of the computer, Dad comes in and starts yelling at me. I eventually stand up and start yelling back. Dad makes an excuse to leave. Dad comes back about a half hour later and starts yelling again, but at this point, it's all I can do to not just laugh. I know that the instant I stand up, the argument will end. It actually wound up being really good for our relationship, because Dad realized that he actually had to make valid points, rather than just going into former drill sergeant mode. Edit, obligatory this blew up etc etc. It looks like I unintentionally may have hit a raw nerve for a lot of people, for which I apologize. And I don't think that I had it anywhere near as bad as some of the people who replied. All I can say is that if you find yourself in a situation where you've got parents whose first response is intimidation or worse, look at how most people who responded eventually got out of the situation. Hang in there, it gets better, and you can find people who will help you if that's what is necessary. Probably watching a few Texas DPS officers realize they couldn't shut down a whole airport. I was working as a flight instructor at small airport on a Saturday afternoon. We had one plane that had an issue on takeoff and veered off the runway. It cartwheeled and totaled the airplane, but fortunately the pilot was not seriously injured. I had a student who was next in line for takeoff when it happened. He called me from his phone as it happened. I hopped in the airport car with one of the rampers and drove out to the plane with a radio to inform inbound planes to use the other runway. We had no control tower. On the way to the runway I called the airport manager, who drove to the airport, and on his way he made a phone call to officially close that runway. About 30 minutes later a metric frickin' of DPS officers showed up and immediately tried to close the whole airport, treating it like a giant crime scene. They were carelessly driving around the airport like they owned the place, ignoring the planes that were moving around, and crossing our only open runway without regard to inbound traffic. A mechanic and I tried to tell them to be careful and they got mad at us. One of them told me they were locking it down a couple times, meaning the whole airport. Now I was a broke ass flight instructor and I had a flight that afternoon that was ultimately going to help pay for me to eat that week. The airport manager was a short stereotypical country guy, also former Navy. He was not intimidated at all by the cops trying to close his airport. When he showed up I was about to go out with a student who was pre-flighting for a cross country. There were about 5 cops in the lobby, me with my flight bag, the airport manager, and a mechanic. One of the cops saw my flight bag and said, "I don't know why you have that or why he's out of the plane. You aren't going anywhere." The moment he finished his sentence the airport manager said, "It's one runway that's closed. The airport is still open." This peered off the cops. I was about to head out the door, and one of the officers said he was driving out to the disabled plane. I'd key, the pilot had been gone for about an hour. The mechanic said you need to be careful and the cop quickly retorted, and why the hell is that? And he said because this is still an airport, and the first thing that hits you is going to be a propeller. A few seconds later a plane took off as one of the cars was approaching the runway intersection, ironing in that point. I walked out, and as I was hopping in the plane with my student, the same cop came up to me and said, "You aren't going anywhere, we're locking this down." I looked at the airport manager who followed all of us out to the ramp. He said, "Have a nice flight, Ajax BU." You could see these cops just fuming that they didn't have the authority to close down an entire airport because one plane went off the runway. The airport had 2 runways. Where the disabled plane was located was probably a mile or so away from the open runway. Why they were making a big fuss, I don't know. The occupant was relatively uninjured. His wife was the worst thing he had to deal with that day. He told her he wasn't going to fly. We had a good flight, and I got to eat dinner that week. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment.